Welcome to Chapter 19, Organizational, Interpersonal, and Group Communication. My hope is that a great deal of the content in this chapter is familiar to you. We've been talking with you about the importance of communication within the healthcare team since you began your foundation course. My hope is in this lecture that we'll have a little bit more focus on how communication is valuable for nurse leaders. As a brief overview, this model should look very familiar. Communication begins the moment two or more people become aware of each other's presence. Effective communication requires the sender to determine what receivers see and hear. The sender cannot always control the actual reception or perception of the hearer. In all communication, there needs to be at least one sender, one receiver, and one message. There also needs to be a mode or a medium in which the message is sent, such as verbal, written, or nonverbal. The core of management activities that cut across all phases of the management process is communication. It's also the core of the nurse-patient, nurse-nurse, and the nurse-physician relationship. When we look at this model, what I want to remind you is that the mode in which you communicate matters based on the topic and content and the emotion of the communication that's occurring. The communication process has internal and external climates that influence how the communication occurs. I'd like you to look at these lists and be familiar with them. There are many variables that affect organizational communication, and several are listed here on this slide. When we drill down to a department level communication, there are numerous factors that influence communication. Differences in gender, power, and employment status can significantly affect the type and quality of organizational and unit level communication. The more the number of people involved in filtering the communication, the greater chance there is for that information to be distorted in its passing from speaker to speaker. These are some suggestions on organizational communication strategies. I think they're pretty straightforward, but I do want you to read through them. Effective communication is vital for managers and leaders to be effective in leading. Effective leaders are congruent in their verbal and nonverbal communication so that the followers on their team are clear about the messages that were received. Good leaders are sensitive to nonverbal and verbal messages. They are looking for inconsistencies, knowing that these inconsistencies between verbal and nonverbal messaging often indicate an unresolved problem or need that needs to be addressed. The incongruence between verbal and nonverbal messaging is the most significant barrier to effective interpersonal communication. I want you to know that when there is incongruence, that the listener experiences an incongruence between the verbal and nonverbal behaviors, they're going to believe the nonverbal messaging before they believe the verbal. So if someone is in a conversation, effective communication is a vital tool for managers and leaders. Good leaders are aware that there needs to be congruence in their verbal and nonverbal communication behaviors. This allows the followers to be clear about the message they receive. Leaders are equally sensitive to the nonverbal and verbal messaging that comes from their followers, knowing that an inconsistency could mean that there's an unresolved problem that needs to be addressed. Incongruence between verbal and nonverbal messaging is the single most significant barrier to effective interpersonal communication. Know that if there is incongruence, the listener will believe the nonverbal messaging more than they will believe the verbal messaging. I want you to understand that information and communication are two different things. This slide provides a pretty good definition. This slide identifies the 5 channels of communication: upward communication, downward communication, and horizontal communication. It's pretty self-explanatory. Diagonal communication occurs when nurse leaders communicate with people in an organization that are not a peer, typically within another department. So a nurse leader having a conversation with a physician. or a nurse leader having a conversation with someone in finance. They are people that are outside their organization, outside their organizational chain of command, but still within the organization. Grapevine is the communication that I want to spend a little bit more time talking about. This is the one channel of communication that occurs at all levels and can make or break a leader. Most of the time it breaks them. Grapevine communication needs to be handled directly and in person. This kind of communication flows quickly, haphazardly, and among people across all hierarchical levels, and usually involves 3 or 4 people at the same time. The sender, the person who sends the communication, is rarely accountable for the message, and the message can become distorted very quickly. This is why it's important for rumors is typically what gets caught up in a grapevine, that a nurse leader directly addresses grapevine communication in person. So an example of this would be that a conversation is overheard from a nurse who happens to walk by a group of leaders and hears that there's going to be a hospital that's going to be closed. The nurse walks down to the break room and says, "I just heard that they're closing our hospital." And from there, the people in the break room go to other people in other areas, and that information is shared so that it goes from a general hospital is going to be closed to their hospital is going to be closed to their hospital is going to be closed within the year. It's going to be closed sooner. Everyone's going to lose their job. It snowballs to where it creates a panic. This is the opportunity for the nurse leader to go to the people involved and directly say, this is the information that's accurate, this is the information that's not accurate, and clarify any questions. This is some example of downward and upward communication. When we think about a downward communication pattern, we think about autocratic leadership styles. If I'm always sending information downward but not receiving anything upward, then I'm not likely to be really getting a full communication experience with my team. So think about downward communication being more autocratic from a leadership style standpoint. Upward communication styles tend to have more of a democratic and a shared governance model. I do want you to be familiar with these. These communication modes should look very familiar. Leaders should use written communication in a way that reflects positively on their organization. Their communication should be clear, professional, use appropriate language, be concise, avoid an authoritarian tone, and be very clear in its purpose. Verbal communication is a highly effective way to communicate. I want you to think about the differences between face-to-face communication and telephone communication. A face-to-face communication mode allows 100% of all the modes to be covered, whereas telephone or the phone loses the greatest mode of communication, and that's the nonverbal. You cannot see someone's nonverbal behaviors over the telephone. Nonverbal communication is absent in writing and in verbal communication that occurs away from the listener. It's important to always avoid written emails, texts, or even a phone call if emotions are high. It's more appropriate for a nurse leader to go to that person face to face where all modes of communication are available and have a direct conversation about something that has created stress in the environment. Nonverbal communication clues. This is a good list. I think you should review this. Proxemics goes back to spatial distance. It's important to know what your personal comfort level is with someone being physically near you and how that level of physical closeness with other people communicates, what that communicates. It may, based on proxemics, it may contribute to a message being sent, whereas someone that's very distant with another may imply a lack of warmth or caring. Too close may violate cultural norms and make people physically uncomfortable and feel threatened. So you want to be very mindful about proxemics when it comes to delivering leadership messaging and what's appropriate. These styles of communication I want you to be aware of and know the difference. When we think about assertive communication, it's a way of communicating that allows people to express themselves in direct, honest, and appropriate ways that do not infringe on other people's rights. I like the concept of Pocahontas. I think she was a very assertive female leader. Passive occurs when a person suffers in silence, although she or he may feel strongly about an issue. The Alice in Wonderland reminds me of a passive listener or communicator. Aggressive can also be perceived as unfeminine, is perceived as someone who's expressing oneself in a direct and often hostile manner that infringes on another person's rights, generally oriented to a win-at-all-cost type of behavior. Cruella de Vil is way up on my list of aggressive types of communicators. Anyone that wants to take 101 dogs and make a coat out of them is not on my list of fans. And our last mode of communication is passive aggressive, and this has this occurs when there's an aggressive message presenting in a passive way. There's limited verbal behavior that's incongruent with a nonverbal message, and I would encourage you to think about your own communication style and how you approach things on a day-to-day basis, and then consider how your style is altered when you're stressed and when you're overwhelmed in a situation. Are you still at your best? And is that an opportunity for growth and improvement for you? These are misconceptions and myths about assertiveness. I'm going to let you read through this list. Dealing with aggressive communication, it's important for you to be able to address an aggressive communicator appropriately. You want to be able to reflect to the person that they're behaving in an aggressive manner. You want to repeat the assertive message that should be that you're hearing in the conversation. You want to point out implicit assumptions. What is being assumed in that conversation? Restate the question using an assertive language, and then allow an opportunity to have questions but with that person. If you're dealing with someone that repeatedly is an aggressor in communication and you can't break that cycle, sometimes you need to physically stop a conversation and re-engage at a later time so that you can have a more fluid discussion, something that is less heated, less emotional during that time. SBAR should be very familiar to you as a communication tool. I do want you to be aware of this and use it appropriately. It is a structured and ordered approach to providing accurate and relevant information in an emergent patient situation, as well as routine handoffs. So I want you to be fluid with this. Listening, I think it's important to remember that we spend 70% of our time listening, but only about a third of all of our messages retained. I try to remember that when I'm lecturing to you, to remember that you're only going to remember so much. This is a mnemonic that helps us remember how we need to listen. I think it's a pretty good tool to look over and just have some general ideas of what the GRRR sounds recommends. I have no idea who thought that writing a GR mnemonic was a good idea. But the ideas behind it with greeting, respectful listening, reviewing what's heard, recommending or requesting more information, and then reward, which is simply thanking someone from having a conversation, I think are all really good interventions to support an appropriate conversation. These are all examples of virtual communication, and I think there's a lot of conversation that's occurring now about the appropriate use of virtual communication within the workplace setting. It's important to remember that despite the advances of communication and technology, that we cannot replace human judgment needed by leaders and managers to use technology appropriately. Technology is so valuable in accessing evidence-based practice documents and literature and journals, but we need to use virtual networking and communication appropriately and always be mindful of patient privacy. I want you to take a look at these principles for social networking. We are developing professional standards for social networking, and I want you to be aware of what they look like. These are the stages of group process. This, I hope it looks very familiar. When we think about the stage of forming, that's the stage that you're meeting other people. Storming is the establishing of the group's identity. It's the push and pull that occurs when you're negotiating roles for everyone. Norming is establishing the rules and designing work. This is when your goals are set for whatever work you have in front of you. Performing is getting the work done. Later, termination was added as a fifth step. And all that means is that the leader guides the members to summarize and express feelings and to celebrate any work that was done. It's important for guidelines in a group to be understood that we know that adding new members to an established group can be disruptive and change productivity and change the group dynamics. Group members perform certain important tasks and facilitate work. Group members also perform roles that assist with group building activities, and then some group members will perform roles to meet their individual needs. Everyone has their own distinct roles and behaviors within a group, and we need to be mindful that those roles can positively or negatively influence a group. These group building and maintenance roles are perceived to be positive roles within a group. This should look familiar from your mental health course. I want you to be familiar with them and know the difference. These are individual roles within a group. These tend to be people that have their own agendas and their own behaviors that drive their behaviors within a group. I want you to be familiar with these and be able to discern the difference between these and the group building and maintenance roles, and understand that these are non-productive roles that decrease the effectiveness and efficiency of groups. Just another reminder about confidentiality and HIPAA. However we're communicating, whether we're communicating in person, on the phone, or using some sort of technology, we need to always be mindful that we are protecting our patients' privacy to the best of our ability, and that we're in compliance with policies and procedures.